Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle a period of history that might just change how you think about the British Empire.
Yeah, those red coats we all picture. We'll forget about them for a second. We're going way back before Great Britain even existed to when England was just starting to try to, make its mark on the world.
That's right. We're talking about the 16th and 17th centuries, a time long before the Victorian era when the British Empire seemed to rule the waves, without even trying. It's really a fascinating story because it challenges the idea of, this inevitable British dominance that we often hear about.
So this is about the first English empire. What makes it so different from what came after? Well, for one thing, this wasn't an empire built by the monarchy, sending out massive armadas. This was the era of the freelancer empire. Think private companies, merchants, adventurers, all funded by investors eager for a piece of the action, a piece of the riches that the new world promised. It was a lot like today's venture capitalists backing startups. Only these startups were establishing colonies and trading posts in far-flung corners of the globe.
Okay, so instead of kings and queens dictating every move, you had these groups of investors deciding where to explore, who to trade with, and how to handle those, difficult situations.
Exactly. Companies like the East India Company and the Muscovy Company were major players. They had immense power, often operating almost like independent states with their own armies and navies. The crown was more like a shareholder, investing in these ventures, but not always calling the shots.
This outsourced empire sounds pretty chaotic. Was the crown really okay with having so little control?
Well, it had its advantages. The crown shared the risk and the burden, and these companies could engage in activities that were diplomatically difficult for the monarchy, like making deals with, shall we say, non-Christian rulers. But it also meant less control on the ground. Things were often messy, and the decisions made by individuals on the frontier could have huge historical consequences.
So it wasn't a simple story of the English arriving and everyone else submitting.
Not at all. This is where the traditional narrative of European colonialism gets flipped on its head. The English faced significant resistance, and their early attempts at empire building were riddled with setbacks and sometimes even outright failures.
They weren't invincible. Tell me more about that.
We'll take the Jamestown colony in Virginia in 1610. It was on the brink of collapse, forced to abandon their settlement because of indigenous resistance. They were saved at the last minute by a relief ship. Imagine that almost becoming a footnote in history because of a lack of supplies and conflicts with the native people.
Wow, close call. What caused them so much trouble?
Powhatan, the powerful leader of a nearby Native American confederacy, made a strategic decision to cut off trade with the colonists. This proved devastating for the English, pushing Jamestown to the brink of starvation and ultimately forcing them to abandon their settlement. It really underscores how the actions and decisions of indigenous people had a profound impact on the course of history.
So indigenous resistance played a major role in shaping where the English succeeded and where they failed.
Absolutely. In fact, the English also struggled for decades to establish a foothold in the Caribbean.
Why was that?
They faced fierce resistance from the indigenous Kalinago people who repeatedly drove the English from the islands they attempted to colonize. These weren't isolated incidents. The Kalinagos' ability to hold off English expansion for decades highlights the crucial role indigenous resistance played across the globe.
That's incredible. I'd never heard that part of the story.
It's often overlooked, but it's a crucial piece of the puzzle when we're trying to understand the complexities of colonial history. If indigenous groups in North America, for instance, had been more united in their opposition, they might have driven the English colonists back into the sea. Their decisions to trade, to ally, or to fight had a significant impact on how history unfolded. And their struggles weren't limited to the Americas either. Look at their attempts to, establish a foothold in Asia. They faced stiff competition from the Dutch and the Portuguese, and their efforts to control trade in places like Japan and China were ultimately failures.
So it wasn't just a matter of the English showing up and taking over. It sounds like they faced pushback everywhere they went.
Exactly. It's important to remember that the world didn't just passively let the English take over. They were constantly pushing back, negotiating, and shaping the terms of engagement.
And that pushback wasn't limited to the places they were trying to colonize overseas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what about places like Ireland?
You're absolutely right. Ireland is a crucial example. It demonstrates that colonialism wasn't just something happening, across the ocean. It was happening right on England's doorstep. And the resistance they faced there foreshadowed many of the challenges they would encounter later in other parts of the world.
So even with all these setbacks, how did England eventually manage to build such a vast empire? What changed?
Well, several factors came into play. One crucial element was the gradual strengthening of the English state over centuries. The union with Scotland, the financial revolution, and the growing profits from colonial ventures, including the tragic slave trade, all provided England with the resources and military might necessary to project power on a global scale.
But didn't events like the English Civil War significantly weaken the state? It seems like that could have easily derailed their imperial ambitions.
That's a good point. The English Civil War undoubtedly caused disruption and instability, but it also ultimately led to a more centralized and powerful state. The monarchy was restored, but Parliament's role in government was strengthened, creating a system that proved more effective at mobilizing resources and projecting power.
So even though it was messy and chaotic, the First English Empire laid the groundwork for what was to come.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the transition from this early freelancer empire to the later British Empire of conquest wasn't neat and tidy. Conquest was always part of the equation, from their dealings in Ireland to their actions in the Caribbean and North America.
It challenges that traditional narrative of a peaceful period of trade and exploration, followed by a later period of violent expansion.
Precisely. The English were using violence and coercion from the very beginning. This idea that there was a clear separation between a first and second empire is simply not supported by the historical evidence.
This all makes me wonder why we tend to oversimplify this period. Why do we latch onto the image of redcoats and the Victorian era while neglecting these earlier, more complicated chapters?
I think there are a few reasons for this. One is that it's simply easier to tell a story of straightforward dominance and triumph. It fits into a particular narrative about British exceptionalism and the inevitability of their rise to power.
It also makes it easier to downplay the role of violence and exploitation in that rise, doesn't it?
Exactly. By focusing on the later stages of the empire, we can gloss over the brutality of those early encounters and the ways in which indigenous people were dispossessed of their lands and
It's
resources.
almost as if we've airbrushed those uncomfortable truths out of the picture.
In a way, yes. And that's why it's so important to re-examine this period with a more critical lens. To understand the complexities of those early encounters, the role of indigenous resistance, and the often brutal realities of colonial expansion.
So if we're going to reevaluate the story of the British Empire, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive into its origins?
Well, first and foremost, we need to recognize that the narrative of inevitable British dominance is a myth. Their success was far from guaranteed, and it depended on a complex interplay of factors, including indigenous resistance, the actions of other European powers, and their own evolving capabilities.
And we can't forget that conquest and violence were central to their expansion from the very beginning. This wasn't just a peaceful period of trade and exploration.
Right. The English were actively involved in dispossessing indigenous people of their lands, enslaving Africans, and waging wars of conquest. We need to acknowledge the full scope of their actions, not just the parts that fit neatly into a narrative of triumph.
And even at the height of their power, their control was never absolute. They constantly faced resistance and encountered setbacks and challenges in every corner of the globe.
This is a crucial point. The story of colonialism is never one of simple dominance. It's a story of constant struggle, negotiation, and adaptation, both for the colonizers and the colonized.
This deep dive has really challenged my assumptions about the British Empire. It's so much more nuanced and complex than I ever realized.
And that's the beauty of history, isn't it? The more we dig, the more we uncover those hidden layers, and the more we realize how much we still have to learn.
Absolutely. It's a constant process of unlearning and relearning, and that's what makes it so fascinating. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the First English Empire, I'm left wondering what this all means for us today. Why should we care about the messy origins of an empire that, for all intents and purposes, no longer exists?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why we study history in the first place. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the roots of the present and how past events continue to shape our world today.
Because the legacies of colonialism are still very much with us,
Mhm.
right? Whether we're talking about global inequalities or political instability or even cultural attitudes and assumptions.
Absolutely. And understanding those legacies requires understanding their origins. How did these power dynamics come to be? What role did violence, resistance, and adaptation play in shaping the world we live in today?
It also challenges us to think critically about the narratives we've been told, doesn't it? To question those stories of straightforward dominance and triumph, and to recognize the agency and resilience of the people who resisted colonial rule.
It's about decentering the narrative, moving away from a Eurocentric perspective and recognizing the contributions and experiences of people from all corners of the globe.
And that's a process that requires us to be open to new information, to challenge our own biases, and to be willing to reevaluate what we thought we knew.
It's about embracing complexity and nuance, recognizing that history is rarely black and white, and that there are always multiple perspectives to consider.
So if we're going to challenge those simplified narratives, what's one thing our listeners should keep in mind when they think about the British Empire?
I think the most important takeaway is that the English were never these unstoppable forces destined to rule the world. Their successes were often built on shaky foundations, riddled with setbacks and fierce opposition, and their failures often stemmed from underestimating the resilience and agency of the people they sought to control.
That's a powerful reminder that history is never inevitable. It's shaped by the choices and actions of countless individuals and groups, and understanding those choices helps us see the world with a more critical and nuanced perspective.
Exactly. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding our present and shaping a more just and equitable future.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the First English Empire. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you've all gained a new appreciation for this often overlooked period of history. What are some other examples of historical narratives that get simplified or overlooked? What can we learn from re-examining them through a more critical lens? Keep those questions in mind, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of history. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay informed and entertained. Until then, happy exploring.